there isn't any feedback. That would be great. So yeah, if you could just mute your microphones, that would be wonderful. And we'll make a start. So the first thing to say is a big welcome to everyone. We've got a large number of delegates, and I know it's the end of a busy day, so thank you for joining us today. And welcome to this EmpathyLab webinar. We're just delighted that so many of you have joined us. We've got people here from schools, from public libraries, from early years settings, early years experts. We've got someone from Australia. So welcome to you all. My name's Sarah Mears. I'm one of EmpathyLab's 5 founders, and I'm here with Paul Jenkins, who's providing all the technical support, and Miranda McKerney. Just a couple of things to tell you about the housekeeping. Firstly, that we'll be filming today's webinar. So if you don't want to be filmed, do feel free to turn off your camera. The structure of the event is that we're going to be having some presentations, but then we will be asking our lovely panel some questions. So if you've got any questions, please do put them in the chat, and if you can preface them by a cue, we'll be able to pick them up more easily. And just to reiterate, if you could mute yourselves, that would be really, really helpful. If not, Paul will come around and mute you, so that's a threat. And as just a reminder to put questions in the chat. So for EmpathyLab, Miranda will be telling you a little bit more about that in a second, but whilst most of EmpathyLab's work has been focused primarily on the primary years and latterly on secondary as well, we're increasingly fascinated by the earliest stages of children's development and the development of empathy in our youngest children. And empathy is just so critical for children's well-being and their ability to thrive in our very volatile and uncertain world. And this year, I think empathy has been needed more than ever. I was just looking at some recent research by YouGov, published by the Sutton Trust, that said 52% of the 570 parents surveyed said they were really concerned about the negative impact of the pandemic on children's social and emotional development. So opportunities to connect children through play and through stories and activities to help them understand each other are really important. So I'm really excited to be chairing this webinar, which focuses specifically on early years with some really distinguished speakers. And first, I'm going to hand over to Miranda McKerney, founder and inspiration behind EmpathyLab, who will tell you a bit more about EmpathyLab and hopefully whet your appetite for the forthcoming Empathy Day.
Great, thank you very much, Sarah, and really lovely to have so many of you with us. It's very exciting. So we founded EmpathyLab in 2014, and it was sparked by an absolutely fascinating building body of neuroscience research, which showed that because of how our brains work when we read, identifying with the feelings of book characters helps us build real life understanding of other people. And we wondered if society and the education system was really absorbing the importance of this research, because if reading is empathy building, then we can harness as a society books' ubiquitous presence to build empathy skills, a hugely exciting double win. So on our quest to find out more, we enlisted the help of some really great expert academic advisors and encountered a second body of scientific research, equally exciting, which is that empathy is learnable. We're not just born with a fixed quantity of it. Only 10% of our empathic ability is genetic, and 98% of us, the scientists say, are capable of learning new empathy skills at any point in our lives, with the obvious caveat that it's best learned as young as possible. So with this research as our foundation stone, we became a small nonprofit, and we've been experimenting lab-like with several interventions. And we think a lot about what levers society has to raise an empathy educated generation. And our program now features 4 main areas: an annual Read for Empathy book collection with 50 books, an in-depth whole school education program, empathy-focused author events, and of course, Empathy Day. And as we grow and develop, we're keen to cater more for early years providers, and this webinar is a marker of that future intention. We passionately believe that empathy is a core life skill that every child needs, not a fluffy thing. and that it's a powerful catalyst for a better future, the root of real understanding and real kindness. And my goodness, as Sarah said, if ever there was a time to be focusing on empathy, it surely has to be now. The pandemic, I think, has shown how very different and unequal people's lives are, and how important it is that we understand what other people are going through. And so many of our children will have seen their communities acting on that and looking out for each other. We've seen a huge wave of community caring, and we believe that offers very precious building blocks for a better future. So EmpathyLab's overall aim is to raise an empathy-educated generation, young people who are inspired to lead a new empathy movement and build a less divided world. A generation who our work aims to take on a 7-step journey from knowing what empathy is right through to putting it into action. Happier children who, as a result of going on this journey, become wonderful citizens, wonderful parents, at the heart of building strong communities and a more civil society. So Empathy Day is nearly upon us on June the 10th. It's one of the absolute high points of our year, when we're driving for empathy to be on everyone's lips, where we have a much needed debate about what we can do to build a more empathic society. And we really hope that all of you, especially the people we've not met yet, will join this movement and work alongside us. So we aim on Empathy Day to help children learn more about empathy, have transformational empathy experiences through literature, and be inspired to put their new insights into action, because we want every day to become an Empathy Day. The theme this year is walking in someone else's shoes, which emphasizes the importance of perspective taking at this time when, as they say, we've all been in the same storm, but such very different boats. And I'm just going to hop to sharing my screen just to show you very quickly a bit about what is on offer for early years providers. So is that showing?
Yep. It is.
Yeah, great. So we have a whole range of offers for our audience, including an early years toolkit, most kindly sponsored by Elmer's publisher, Anderson Press. And this has ideas and resources for face-to-face rhyme times to help children practice building eye contact, feeling close to the adult they're with, and exploring emotions. Picking up on the day's theme of walking in somebody else's shoes, the toolkit suggests helping them understand more about the rhyme's characters by thinking about the shoes they need, and these are the accompanying shoe cards. There are two, the story kit has two suggested story activities, 30-minute sessions, one with Elmer, exploring the skill of perspective taking and imagining his feelings when no one has time for him, and one using Rebecca Cobb's gorgeous picture book, Hello Friend, which really helps children understand more about how friendship develops, taking the perspective of two very, very different children in the story. We also have a very exciting illustration gallery, and obviously illustration plays a vital role in helping young people explore and understand the feelings of others. So in the countdown week to Empathy Day, we're honoured to be launching 9 absolutely brilliant Read for Empathy illustrations from some of our finest children's illustrators. And you're free to use these for a month after Empathy Day. Here on a very strictly embargoed sharing secrets basis are 2 of them, one from Rebecca Cobb and one from Salvatore Rubino. So that's an incredibly quick canter through. And I can't finish without inviting you, or all of you, to the empathy conversation, which ends the day at 6 o'clock on the 10th of June, a cutting edge cross-disciplinary debate about empathy in society and in books, with a leading psychologist, Professor Robin Banerjee, and authors Michael Rosen, Catherine Johnson, and David Baddiel, whose books all feature in our 2021 collection. And you can imagine what it means to us to have Michael join us after all he's been through this year. So I'm going to stop screen sharing and hand back to Sarah.
Thank you, Miranda. That's great. Thank you very much for that. Yeah, we're really excited about Empathy Day and the empathy conversation, so we can't wait. We're on a countdown now. And when we discovered quite a couple of years ago now a book called Developing Empathy in the Early Years, a Guide for Practitioners, we were so excited. It's a fabulous read full of evidence-based practical advice in a really readable format, and I personally use the book all the time, so I'm really thrilled to introduce you to the author of that book, Helen Garnet, who's going to talk a bit about how empathy grows and why it's so important for children's well-being. So over to Helen.
Oh, that's lovely. Thank you so much. I'm just going to share mine. Can everyone see that? That's so kind of you. What a lovely introduction. Yes, so I'm going to talk about how empathy grows and why it is important for children's well-being. So Ken Robinson, who I was a huge fan of, was so lovely and wrote a foreword in my book. And this was something that was hidden amongst the foreword. And he put, empathy is not evenly distributed and it needs to be cultivated. And that's why, you know, the EmpathyLab was created, I imagine, because we want to cultivate and to distribute. And certainly why I wrote my book. I'm sure it's why Fiona does her illustrations, why, you know, we're all here. We want to distribute and cultivate empathy. But what is so good about empathy? Well, empathy is obviously really good for other people, isn't it? Because, you know, the more empathetic we become and the more we understand other people's feelings and the more we can support them, bring joy, reduce stress, reduce conflict, all of that. It's an incredible thing. And we are really boosting other people's well-being. And that is why we want to cultivate it. But it's also incredibly good for ourselves as well. I just wanted to read you this. Studies have found that being empathetic is linked to increases of our own feelings of happiness, well-being, and life satisfaction for people of all ages. So that's from very small children right the way up to, you know, 100 plus. And people who carry out acts of kindness and are empathetic are found to experience greater well-being. Well, if that's an incredible fact, and it's a true one. And I think empathy is more than just the skill that it is. It has this incredible potential to change environments and change people and to bring happiness everywhere. So it's so important. That's what's so good about empathy. An incredible thing about empathy is that it does keep on growing. We don't just sort of realize, oh, well, do you know what, my empathy levels are just really full now and I'm fine and I'm okay, I'm brilliant. No, it just doesn't work like that. We just keep on growing. And when I wrote this book, I think it's 4 years ago now, I can absolutely swear since then that I have definitely become more empathetic because I'm very intentional about being empathetic, but I've also noticed the gaps in my empathy as well. And so I can therefore go back to those gaps and sort of work on those. And one of the gaps I have, and maybe you'll understand this one, is when I'm tired, or as my family say, cross and grumpy. Mummy, are you cross and grumpy? When I'm that, I'm less empathetic than I can be when I'm rested and regulated. So being rested and regulated is so important to grow empathy. And that's why earlier settings, we need to be rested and regulated. You may think, well, how can we do that? How can we do that? But it's so important because that's how empathy grows. I was outside in a village hall, gosh, about 2 years ago, and I overheard someone cry, a little boy or girl crying inside, and it went on and on and on. And then suddenly one of the teachers said, and it was all behind closed doors, are you going to stop that soon? And I could feel, obviously, that they were stressed. They were not regulated themselves, the teacher. And so empathy can't really grow in that kind of environment. But I just wanted to tell you a very quick story about a little girl I had in my class, because I want to talk about group empathy as well. I had a lovely class of year ones. They were gorgeous. And a little girl came into the class a little bit into the term, the first term, and her mother had died 4 months before. And it was just such a sad story. And so the class were prepared for this little girl to come in. They were only 5 going on 6, this class. They were very little. And they were so lovely to her. And a few weeks into this term, we were lining up to go outside. And this little girl, I'll call her Sophie, her name wasn't Sophie, started to cry. And she just said, I want my mummy, I want my mummy. And with tears down her face and just utterly, utterly bereft. And it was so heartbreaking. So I scooped her up, put her on my lap, said to my wonderful TA, Mrs. Gleed, I said, you know, could you take the children out? And me and Sophie will follow on soon. And the children all came up one by one to just touch Sophie on her shoulder or her head, or put Sophie, oh, we'll see you in a minute, Sophie, all of them. It was an incredible act of empathy. And that empathy that they had, that roots of empathy that they were displaying then, they didn't fully understand it all. It grew throughout the year. And by the end of the year, they were incredible with this little girl, and it would have so helped with her healing. And if she'd been in another class where it wasn't so empathetic, it would not have, she wouldn't have got to where she did by the end of that year. It was amazing. So empathy grows when we're intentional about it and when it's modeled. It was an amazing time that year. So I just want to talk very quickly about empathy. It's a skill made up of many other skills. It's not empathy is a skill, it's lots of them. Understanding feelings and other people's feelings, and managing your own feelings and how you're feeling around other people's feelings, and then understanding and managing perspectives. And then these two, confidence and optimism. You think, well, what's that doing there? Confidence is a skill. We're not born confident or unconfident. It's a skill that we learn. We're not born optimistic or pessimistic. It's a skill that we learn. And I think an empath is more effective when they're confident, and they're more effective when they're optimistic. It's really important. And all of these skills feed self-regulation and emotional intelligence, because it's really clear to me that if we're not regulated, as I said before, we can't really be properly empathetic. And the first step, I think, really important step for children to learn about empathy is when adults co-regulate children. And that co-regulation, it's such a beautifully empathetic act when we're helping them with their really difficult feelings and bringing them back to a place of calm, bringing them back to a place where they can feel, they can. Well done. And so this co-regulation is a really key part in modeling empathy, because that's what it is. It's an act of empathy in itself. And so quickly onto my last slide. To be truly empathetic, we need these 4 corners, if you like, of empathy. And they're so intentional. We have to be intentional about empathy. If we're not intentional, we're doing it in a sort of half-hearted way. When we are intentional, we are automatically wholehearted. And someone who is wholehearted and they're present for that person, they're listening actively to that person, they're thinking actively around that whatever they're thinking about, and they're acting actively, that intentionality about it is so, so powerful. And so a half-hearted person can't really be as empathetic as a wholehearted person. And the thing about being wholehearted, what is so beautiful about that is people who are wholehearted have higher levels of well-being. And when we've got higher levels of well-being, then we can be more empathetic. It's like a spiral, a rising spiral. It's just so lovely. So thank you so much. And I'm now going to hand you back to Sarah.
Thank you, Helen. Thanks so much for that. And that being wholehearted and being intentional is a powerful message. Thank you again.
Pleasure.
Whenever we talk about empathy in the early years, June O'Sullivan, MBE, CEO of the London Early Years Foundation, it's always recommended to us. And last Empathy Day, June wrote a fabulous blog about empathy, and we really couldn't wait to work with her. So I'm very delighted now to hand you over to June.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you to Helen. That was very beautiful, actually, what Helen just said, very empathetic. And I love the fact that you linked co-regulation, because that is a much misunderstood concept at the moment, regulation. And it is not sitting still and being good, but it's actually about figuring out how you manage yourself. And in my world, many of our children come from families that are not very well regulated, and there is no protective, empathetic blanket easily achieved in their homes. And so the fact that you can learn to be empathetic, which Miranda said at the beginning, is really critical, because once you can do that, you can, there's a sense of hope. And I think empathy drives hope, and hope is that positive feeling. So in terms of early years, then I'm not going to offend childminders now by just talking about nurseries, but if you're a childminder in the group, assume that I'm thinking about you as well. But because I run nurseries, I use the language of nurseries quite often, but it doesn't mean that I'm not thinking about other settings. But when you think about an early year setting, and currently at the moment, we're in the most bizarre situation, are we not? Where our children are in bubbles. The human contact is slightly broken, in the sense that it's not, you know, a free flow interconnection like you would normally have. And if you think about our little babies, for example, if you were to say to somebody on a course that you were doing, now the way we settle babies is this: we put a mask on our faces and we take the baby to the door, and another person with a mask receives the baby, and then we bring this baby into a bubble that has only a few people there all the time, and they stay in that tiny group. You would say, are you mad? And that is what we're dealing with at the moment. So the notion of empathy is really central, I think, to understanding how people might feel, and the ease by which we might say, oh, you know, they're settling very well, or, you know, she's not crying anymore. But I mean, you know, we have to ask ourselves the question: is the stopping of the crying simply the child just given up and just accepted that this is their life, or is the lack of the crying that they have settled? And because children are beautifully resilient, but to create an empathy around that is important. And for me, it comes from leadership. It comes from kind, empathetic leadership, where you are set up in the way you decide how you want to lead, and you create an environment and a culture of kindness, and the processes underneath that actually drive that kindness. Because not to continually keep requoting Helen, but she does talk about emotional intelligence, and I have written a number of books about leadership, and I would say to you, if there was one thing that would see you through, it's to be emotionally intelligent. And again, that can be learned and can be developed. So it's not something you can't ever acquire or be frightened by. So imagine you're walking into your nursery or your setting, and so you therefore want a kind, empathetic leader who is connected with themselves, who is in control of their amygdala hijack and know when they're about to be hijacked, because you've got to deal with a difficult situation or a level of conflict. You know what to do. You have learned your self-regulation. You know, for you, it's a walk around the block, it's a deep breath, it's a role play, it's a cup of tea, whatever it is, you know how to do it. And if you think that you've taught yourself how to do that, so you're no longer waking up in the middle of the night, writing things down on Post-its, you know, that actually you're learning to be calm, then the children have that experience as well, because you have that calmness and you do understand how to step back and look in and understand how the child is feeling and be able to step in their shoes for a minute. And we've been doing a lot of work around inclusion and diversity. So my thinking is, create an inclusion environment and you tend to drive diversity because people want to be with you. It's warm, it's an engaged environment, and you feel truly warmly welcomed. And that is, to me, is a really empathetic step. And it's not about ticking a box or filling a policy or keeping Ofsted happy. It's about because you're generally open and warm and you want to encourage that behavior and culture in your organization. And there are many ways that we in early years can do this, because we can create that environment in the way we teach and in the way we respond and in the way we give the child a voice. Children don't often have a voice, and we know for sure from research that children from more disadvantaged backgrounds often don't have a voice. And so one wonderful way of doing that we do at LEAF is the helicopter story time. So helicopter story time comes from the work of Vivian Gusson-Paley, and I've just done actually a podcast with Trisha Lee from Make Believe Arts on this very matter, because these things matter a great deal. But helicopter time is where the children sit around and they tell the story themselves, one after the other in a very fixed way, and then we record it and then they act it out. Very simple, low on resources, but it gives every child a voice. And it's in that conversation you can start to think about how does it feel to be somebody else? What does it look like if you're somebody else? Why are you feeling so sad? And we're going to hear later from the lovely Fiona's book, which is all about how you feel. There are other books like Giraffes Can't Dance, which give you a real impression of what it must feel like to be a giraffe who can't dance, and how does other children feel in that? Shy children, children who are uncomfortable, children whose first language isn't English and they're just figuring it all out, children who have got other challenges in their lives, children who's just moving home, children who's had a new baby, children whose marriage, where their family's marriage is breaking up or partnership is separating. There are all those things going on. So to understand that, I think, and to create an environment which allows those children to have that bit of space is really important, and helicopter is a good way of doing that. So indeed is having a sofa. Every LEAF nursery has to have a sofa. Now, because of the chintz business, and all the stains and everything else that go on the chintz, I insist that it's faux leather, because it's easier to keep clean. But there is nothing more important than the pedagogy of the sofa, as I would call it, where a child can crawl in there, can feel safe on there, someone can sit up there and snuggle next to them and read a storybook. An empathetic staff member can see what that looks like, and recognize a child might need a little bit of a hug or a quiet word or whatever they feel able to do. And so there's another thing. A third thing is there's about calm, and thinking about your environment it's calm. Sometimes in the early years we can be a little robust in the decor of our nurseries. We can fill it with color, and often people, grown-ups, adults, think about early years as loving bright colors and big murals and all that. Well, actually, children need calm. They need to impose themselves on the environment. I really one of those magnolia people, where really we don't count, and actually is what they impose on us that matters. But also, if you're a child who isn't from an experience where it's not particularly empathetic to them, they're in a lot of chaos, they're in a lot of discord, to come into a calm environment and be rested and be able to settle and feel safe is really important. And it's a real cultural, empathetic culture. Just a couple of more to finish. The other thing about communities is, the other thing about empathy is community. So it's about how do you reach out as much as you reach in. We saw some really lovely stuff from our nursery managers during the COVID, where they noticed families were in real trouble, particularly around food, and they were very alert to the fact that you could misread that or make people feel uncomfortable. So they did all sorts of interesting things, created healthy meal bags that we delivered, built a food bank where one nursery helped another and they told stories. One of the parents made a Christmas dinner for 15 parents, in fact, and we delivered it. One of the children in one of the nurseries didn't have a bike, and it was noticeable, and she lives with her grandparents, and there was some financial issue there, and so we managed to get one of our bikes, and was all done as part of a sort of a game and a learning experience, rather than picking her out and kind of giving her something in that sort of way. Visiting the elderly, connecting with people outside, thinking about the environment and how you are in the garden, you know, looking after the little plants, looking after the animals, being alert to the birds, all of those things you might not think are about empathy, but all of those things drive empathy. You know, using Makaton to help, you know, children to be able to have a deep breath before they sort of try and say what they have to say. And all of those things are, again, creating a culture of empathy. And the early years is such a perfect place, and it's full of so many fantastic people who can listen carefully, who can seize the moment and explore it and help that child to get through by working with them, holding their hand, metaphorically as well as in reality, and create that kind of empathetic world, an empathetic festival, where we actually understand how children learn and how we support their learning and how we give those children a voice, but a voice that we listen to and a voice that is heard.
Thank you so much, Jean. That was lovely, and I love the idea of the culture of empathy. And just to say, just if everyone's got any questions for June or Helen, do start to put them in the chat. So we'll have some time at the end for you to ask questions. And I've been jotting loads down as I go, so I don't want to dominate the questions, but so do jot them down. For EmpathyLab, books are at the heart of everything that we do. It's why we exist, and so we're in for such a treat now as I hand over to Fiona Lumbers, the illustrator, who's done some just wonderful illustrations of really empathetic characters and the relationship between them. So I'm going to hand over to Fiona, and you'll take it from there.
Hi, thanks so much, Sarah. Paul, could you share the screen for me and pop up the first image if possible?
Not a problem.
Thank you so much. Paul's helping me out because I'm a bit of a technophobe, so
Hopefully you can see that.
So I'm a picture book illustrator, and I've been making picture books for the last 5 years, some that I write and some that I illustrate for other authors. And in the Lunar Love series, I get to work with the wonderful Joseph Coelho, who, if you know of him, he's just wonderful. He writes in such an empathetic way that it's very easy to cultivate the characters around his writing. And so this is a page from Lunar Love's Art, which is the second book in the Lunar Love series. In the first book, Lunar Love's Library Day, we got to meet Luna and understand the dynamics of her family, how her parents are separated, and her special day of the week is spending time with her dad at the library. And then in this second book, Lunar Love's Art, we go to a school trip to the local art gallery, and we get to meet a little boy called Finn. And Luna's character exudes empathy. She seems to spot moments and be able to hone in on characters and sort of understand when people need someone with them. So there's a little boy in the story called Finn, and we meet him at the beginning of the story, and he's all alone. Everyone else is excited about the trip, and he's just kind of stood on his own. And so through the story, Luna gets to know him. And in order to build the characters, I actually spent time, I mean, I've got young children anyway, and I've been through the school system with them, but I also spent a lot of time in gallery settings, just observing and just seeing how children interact and how they react to art and how they react to one another. And so I kind of built the characters around that. And it's so interesting, you know, I think there's so much to be learnt from just observing. So that's kind of where most of my information for the characters comes from. So in this slide, they're in the big room, and Luna's saying, look at all the art, and Finn's just kind of stood there a bit overwhelmed. And if we could go to the next slide, Paul, please. Okay, so further along in the story, they've been through lots of different rooms of art, and then they get to this spread in the book where the children are given pens and paper to make copies of the art in the gallery. And Luna's trying to befriend Finn, and she does a drawing, but wants to show Finn and sort of help him, ask him to kind of join in with her. But he's frustrated, and he scrunches up her picture and has to be taken aside. And Luna's obviously upset and asks her mum, why is he so mean? And the mum is able to explain to Luna that actually maybe he just is behaving in that way because he needs a friend. And it gives Luna a different perspective on it, that actually he's not being mean, it's just that he doesn't know how to react. So that was quite an interesting spread to illustrate, because, you know, we've all been around children that behave in certain ways that don't necessarily reflect how they're actually feeling. And then if we could go to the last slide, please, Paul. Further along in the story again, we get to find out that actually Finn's problems lie in the fact that he doesn't think that, he's obviously got problems at home. And when he's shown a sculpture called Family Group, he says families don't look like that. And so then Luna's mum's able to take him aside to a quiet space within the gallery and explain to him that all families are different. Some are related, some are not, some are together, some are apart. And it just kind of sets a different motion within the story, in that he feels understood, and he's able to then relax into the school trip and engage with the other children. And as the story progresses, we then see him actually having a really great time at the gallery. And so it was just really nice to go on that journey through the story. And it's so well written by Jo that actually illustrating it was fairly easy for me, I think, I would say. So in conclusion, I would say that illustrating children's picture books is a real privilege, and being able to convey different ways in which children can experience empathy through a story is at the heart of what I do. And so, yeah, I think that kind of concludes where I'm at with that.
Oh, thank you so much, Fiona. And somebody's put in the chat how much they love Luna Loves Library Day, and I do too. And Luna Loves Art is just so beautiful as well. And I think it shows another side of Luna. So if you know Luna from Luna Loves Library Day, we've got another side of her here, perhaps growing up a little bit and understanding the people around her. And she's got two very empathetic parents in different ways, I think. And I think that's a question I'm going to just throw out. I hope that's okay to you. Is about in both June and Helen, well, and Fiona, about how do we convey the empathy, the importance of empathy to parents of our early years children? So, you know, we're creating cultures of empathy in our environments, but how do we make sure parents are understanding that too?
I mean, for me, I would say that that's kind of the role of the picture book, is to convey that to parents through storytelling as well, to kind of show the importance of maybe when a grown-up can step in and guide a situation, to sort of like convey the empathy in that situation. But let me pass over to June and Helen, because I'm sure they've got a much better way of phrasing it.
Well, I'm not sure I've got a better way of phrasing it, Fiona, and I wish I could draw like you. So sometimes that's what you need, is a visual, actually, to explain things. Many parents, when they use childcare, are stressed because they're dropping off in the morning and they're dropping off in the afternoon, and they're kind of under a great deal of pressure. So sometimes empathy is in short supply. So a couple of things that we do that are quite practical is like having a parent buddy system, because, you know, when you join a nursery, you might not be sure how to play it out. And sometimes what happens is the child doesn't know how to respond when you come to collect them, and so they run away, or they want to continue playing, and the parent doesn't know what to do, and you see the kind of discomfort in them. And it's about, how do you step right by them and walk by them? You know, a pedagogue is somebody who walks alongside someone, and I think us in the early years, we are pedagogues, and we have to understand that sometimes you have to walk with somebody and take them with you to explain it. One of the techniques I use a lot, and my lovely staff use a lot, is pedagogical conversation, where you frame the conversation in a way that opens up what's happening to the parent in the language that they understand. So if you've got some fancy pants professor who can talk, you know, highfalutin, and you can quote with them, and you'll use that language. Then you've got some very pressed parent who wants to know why their child's behaving like this or whatever. Then you can talk in a more kind of reasoned way, because one thing that a good nursery has and a good childminder is got a warm relationship with the parents, so that you can step into their shoes and see they're actually not being mean, they're actually just harassed, and sometimes they just don't know how to deal with it. And one thing we're seeing a lot at the moment, and I'm sure many in the audience recognize this, is the boundary issue, where actually the boundaries are, there's two kind of confused boundaries. There's one where the parent never says no, and I have to sort of sometimes talk to them about the fact that this child is 3 years old and you can negotiate to a certain point, but the word no is not going to traumatize them, and they may use it, and they should use it more often but clearly. And then the other is where they explain to the child to such a degree that it's too much for them. You know, a little child having to hear the whole rigmarole of the parents' kind of inner workings is overwhelming for a child, and they might think, oh, this is negotiation, this is about explaining. But sometimes you have to be the parent and you have to step in, and I think a good quality teacher understands that and can sort of walk with them and talk with them. And if that means having parent body systems or parent evenings, or what's often called a coffee morning, there's no coffee is ever served, one of those where you can actually explain it, because I don't think often parents can recognize the temper tantrum, as they would call it, and we use language that's so negative about children's tempers. But actually children aren't in temper. Children are desperately trying to self-regulate, and they need someone to help them to do it. So when you use the horrible terms like toddler taming, and that, it just doesn't help for parents to actually then demonstrate a kind of empathetic response to their children.
Great, thank you. Helen, are you on mute?
Yeah, no, I'm just going to add, I think that's absolutely right, what both Fiona and June have just been saying. And as I was saying before, if we're not regulated as parents or as teachers, it's really difficult to be empathetic. And so anything that teachers and childminders can do to help parents regulate, and you're right, June, when they come in the morning, when they pick up in the afternoon, it's a very stressful thing, pick up and mornings and evenings, and I think that I remember once I went to a course, and it was about parent partnerships, when I had my own nursery, and hearing the person say parents are always doing their best, they're never judged, they're always doing their best, and it absolutely changed mindset for me at that point. And I think, it's such an opportunity for early years to support parents and to help them regulate on a daily basis. And then, of course, empathy will happen naturally if they're in part of a sort of wonderfully warm, cozy, I love that pedagogy of the sofa that June was talking about. That kind of pedagogy is so important. And then empathy can start to grow for those parents.
Thank you, Helen. I'm just going to look. There's so many questions coming into the chat, so I don't want to. So I think what I'm going to do is ask people to ask a question and target it at one person, so that we get as many as we can through. So Margaret Street, you've asked an interesting question about managing the well-being of children. Do you want to unmute yourself? And sorry, Helen, is it?
Yes, well, I'm just thinking that, you obviously want children to be empathic and to show, understand how other people are feeling, but you're going to get many children and adults as well who then take on responsibility for other people's well-being, which, we do want to happen a little bit, but for some children, that's just going to be overwhelming. And I'm just concerned about their well-being. If that's the sort of child that you have in a setting, and how we manage that.
Yeah. June or Helen, do you want to respond to that? Helen?
I would love to, yeah, because it's such an interesting question. Thank you so much, Margaret. And I think this is very much about emotional contagion. So when, some children are far more contagious to feelings than others, and adults as well. And we did an emotional contagion quiz, or you can find them online and do them and see how emotionally contagious you are. And for those children, they will take on, we automatically absorb other people's feelings without being aware of it. So even online now, Even online now, there's this sort of part of our brain that can pick up other people's feelings. You know, when you go into a room and you think, why am I suddenly feeling joyful, or why am I suddenly feeling ugh? And particularly in an early year setting, it's rife for emotional contagion. And I think that's the first thing to look at. And you can just find an emotion contagion quiz and do it with your children and just see who's more emotionally contagious. And then you can support them, because children who are more emotionally contagious will find it, you're right, Margaret, they'll find it much harder. But if they realize actually that's somebody else's feeling and I don't have to feel that, and they can learn that really quite young, 4 or 5 years old, if we teach them that, then I think that helps that problem a lot. And of course, empathy is a huge skill. It's the feeling, it's the thinking, and it's the doing. And when children are little, the bit they'll get is the feeling. Oh, it's so hard. And then want to do anything they possibly can to stop themselves feeling. It's not fully empathetic yet, because it's almost more about themselves than it is the other child. But I think we can start with emotional contagion, definitely.
Thank you.
I've got an interesting question from Catherine Lord about Montessori pedagogy. Catherine, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yes, I don't know a lot about EmpathyLab, so excuse my ignorance. But it's based around obviously storybooks. Is there a way of the explored ways in which the children might use their hands? How might you be able to show the story? I know you did mention about the drama and people and children acting out, so that would be one way, wouldn't it, as well? But I'm just wondering about actually the telling, the sharing of the story. You've got the illustrations, but have you got a sensory motor ways as well of sharing the stories? I come from a sort of godly play and deep talk background, which is where we share stories using objects. So I guess that's partly where my question has come from as well.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I could sort of just throw some stuff in from the EmpathyLab perspective. Is that all of our focus on stories is about finding creative and immersive ways to really deepen children's understanding of story and step inside the shoes of the characters. So we do a lot of work that's around helping children use all of their senses to understand a story. So feeling things, tasting things, hearing the sounds, so and using a lot of drama. So yeah, we're really quite excited about that in EmpathyLab and try and use it all the time. And if you see some of the activities that we'll do on Empathy Day, if you watch some of those, you'll see what the kinds of things that we're doing. So yeah, so thank you for that.
Thank you.
It's a good question. Who else have we got? Let's have a look at some of the others. There's so many questions. We've got one from Katie, who I'm going to ask. It's quite a long one, so I shall just go up to Katie's one, which I just found. And here we go. So Katie says, as a nursery manager turned librarian myself, I loved everything you were saying, and this is to June, and completely agree. I'm interested in your thoughts about how to challenge staff mindsets. A lot of people who work with children are of the distraction, stop crying mindset, but I think empathy is about letting feelings be. And yeah, so June, do you want to, have you got any comments on that?
I totally understand where that person is coming from, because when you frame some of the ways that staff have been trained in the early years, it's often within the context of behavior management. It's about this sense of control, about putting a sort of a box around the behavior. Now, you don't want children do need boundaries, and they do need to feel safe. So I'm not suggesting that, we have no boundaries, but I do think that staff are not always understanding of a child's perspective. And I'll be quite critical here of the training that quite a lot of staff get in the early years, which doesn't actually explore the why enough, the why children is, the development of the children. I go back to the days of Mary Sheridan, as to what development looks like. And I don't think that you can really be empathetic to your children unless you really understand how they learn and how they develop. And that's really important. And I think we all have a duty to make sure that our staff are constantly trained in that. And how do you deflect a situation? How do you take a deep breath breadth. And there's quite a lot of work at the moment about people's own sort of biasness. And a lot of that tends to be wrapped around the kind of more conversations around race. But we also need to have it around the conversation about our own feelings about behaviors and the way we were brought up, to what is expected, what isn't expected, what is allowed, what isn't allowed, you know, what would be tolerated and what wouldn't be tolerated. And really, you as a manager have a fantastic opportunity, I think, to really develop that conversation and develop the expertise in your team to be able to step back and reflect and actually say to themselves, why am I so cross about this child being upset? What is it about me what is it about it that's getting right in here? And really thinking it through, because I think once we learn to discuss this and be able to name it, but to do that, you need to create a really safe space, a really safe environment where staff don't feel terrified that if they say, actually, it's something to do with how I feel or how I am or where I at or my experience, that actually they won't be then, you know, picked on or told off or criticized, that actually they'll be able to use that as a starting point of a deeply reflective conversation.
Thank you, Jean. Wow. Interesting one about stories from Annalise. Annalise, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question? Is there? Okay. No. Annalise is talking. Annalise said, I think sharing stories to explain empathy is a really good tool for children who may struggle to understand. Children with ASD, for example, may be able to relate through stories more so than in real life. So Helen, Fiona or June, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I absolutely, as a mother of a child with ASD, you know, he's 32 now, but yes, I absolutely think that stories are so important for children who may struggle with not being understood, really. And I think, you know, if anyone's got a child here with anything, you know, ASD or whatever, it's not being understood, isn't it? And I think that living a story, so I remember coining this phrase a few years ago, living the story, for children who have this is amazing, because you bring a story to life and you actually live it in a way that really helps that child. And some children, you know, sensory things might be a no-no. Just maybe you just have a dark den somewhere and they can sit inside there and just sort of live this story inside there. Different ways of doing stories, aren't there? And I remember we had a child who you know, with ASD in our setting, and he was just crazy about sharks, absolutely, totally crazy about sharks. And so it was a wonderful way, and he found it very difficult to be around other children in the same, you know, socially very difficult. So we just did a lot of things about sharks, and stories about sharks for a long time, and it really drew, you know, other children in, and his expertise on sharks was extraordinary. I learned so much about sharks. Ask me anything about sharks, I know about sharks. And so I think, yes, I think it's a wonderful way of, and being really thinking outside the box. You know, you do not have to sit in a reading corner with books. You can take them everywhere. And that's what these particular children need. They need books to be taken somewhere that feels safe and a part of their world. You know, bring the books to them if necessary.
Can I just add to that, Sarah?
Of course.
It's very useful if you reflect on your day in the nursery and look at what I call the dead time. One of the dead times is this obsession staff often have of getting the children to queue up. And then there's always someone at the beginning of the queue who spends his whole time having it's often a boy whose name is called 58 times. And I say to the staff, what on earth are you doing queuing up when you could have half those children outside? And the other thing is queuing for the toilet. And one of the ways of addressing that is to have a basket of books by the loo. And so when the children are waiting, instead of killing each other and pummeling each other and spend the whole time is like being told off or being called or their names being called or whatever it is, that actually they have the books there, and the children, you find it immediately calms them down, and immediately they start to look together. And then finally, the other thing is nobody in the early years courses are actually taught to read a story. There is an assumption that somehow or other, because we choose to to work with small children, we're automatically marvelous storytellers. I have met fantastic storytellers, and I have met the worst possible storytellers also. And so it's a question of, how do you read a story? How do you engage in the story? How do you use, nuance? How do you use pace, pause, and all of those things? And that should be on every single course. And that should be one of the tests when you're interviewing a member of staff to join your team, is to have them tell a story to the children and see. And also not even use the book. As the children often say to me, is tell me a story with your mouth. So it's understanding that, how we use those things in a way that brings everybody happiness in the end.
Okay, so I've got Alia who can't unmute herself, so I'm just going to ask Alia's question, and then we've got Kim who's raised her hand. I'm really sorry we're not going to get to everyone's question because there are some so fascinating questions, but we'll try and save the questions so that we can see if we can find some answers to some of them afterwards. But Alia says, how do you advise to empathise with a child who's really down on themselves to try and get attention without feeding the problem?
Oh God. Oh dear. When a child is trying to get attention, they need attention. You give them attention. You get on that sofa, that pedagogy of the sofa, and you give them attention. Oh my goodness me. So I don't quite. So how do you empathize with a child who's really down on themselves? And they're trying to get attention. So are we talking about attention seekers here? Is that what we're talking about, do you think? I suppose we are. So for me, I love attention seekers because they are able to communicate that, please attend to me because I have a need and it's huge and I don't know how to communicate it. And so it's like being a detective. What is their need? And just trying to find that out. And as soon as we dig down deep and we find out what their need is, and of course this is what empathy is, isn't it? And I know how hard it is to do that in a setting when you've got, hundreds of other children there as well, to give that child that's constantly needing more attention. But if they constantly need more attention, then they have a massive need. And it's just about digging deep and seeing what that need is.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Kim, do you want to ask your question?
Sorry, I pressed it wrong, so just ignore that.
Okay. Okay, so I think we've probably got time for one more question. Let's have a look let me see who. It's really hard to pick all these questions out of here, so let me find some. Oh, actually, I'll tell you, there is one. Rosaline has asked if someone would mind explaining the term regulation, because we're from a wide range of different backgrounds and settings. It would be really helpful if someone could explain the term regulation.
Regulation is a much contested term at the moment, Rosaline, I have to say, and it's got caught up in some of the policy thinkers. So the worst description of it is sitting still and behaving yourself, and the proper description of it is really how do you feel, and it's a kind of metacognition. It's like, how do you find those techniques to help you to manage your feelings and your ability to learn? So figuring out that if you a deep breath, or figuring out that you can do it better if you're outside. And it's helping children to do that, and helping them to get a sense of control and understanding of what helps them to learn and helps them to manage their own feelings and ways of behaving. I guess that would be my interpretation. I'm sure Helen will bring something more beautiful to it all.
I think, no, that's absolutely it, isn't it? And I think it's, it is not about behavior. It's about, as you say, just being able to know that I can, that's what I'm feeling. This is what I can do to help myself not feel this and to bring myself back to a place of calm. And it goes for, adults as well. I'm still learning to regulate now. I'm 60, but I'm doing a great job. But it is really important. I realize that when I'm tired, I need to sleep. That's how I regulate. And when I'm overwhelmed, I perhaps need to go somewhere quiet. And so having places, in the setting where you can go to, where children know that's where I can go, the pedagogy of the sofa, that's where I go to calm down, or that dark den is where I go when I need to just have a little bit of peace and quiet. It's a very, very valuable thing. And that co-regulation is when adults help the child find, in those skills, because self-regulation is a massive skill made up of lots of other skills. And the co-regulation bit is when adults help them to become that self-regulator, which is such a powerful, powerful thing.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
totally agree.
I'm going to squeeze in one tiny last question. It's not a tiny last question, it's probably a huge question, but for Fiona, because somebody's asked Fiona about the difference between stories that use real people compared to those that use personified animals. Do you have any views about that?
Oh.
I mean, that's a really interesting question. And from my own experience, I've only actually ever illustrated books with actual characters, like real life people. And so I can't really, I think sometimes I think it's sometimes a useful tool to have an animal instead of a person, so you can, so the child can step back and not feel that it's exactly about them, but that this character has experienced a similar kind of experience to them, but it's then a step removed. I think there's a lot of picture books coming out now in the last couple of years that really, kind of address a whole range of different emotions that children experience in such a clever way. And I think that, whether that's with a child character or an animal character, I think there's lots of different ways of exploring those emotions. So I think it's really just a matter of what kind of suits the child as much as anything. But ultimately, a picture book is about telling a story, and you want the child to be engaged with that story. So whatever that takes, whether that's an animal or a person, I that's kind of where I'm at with it, I think.
Fantastic. Thank you. Well, thank you all. We're just out of time now, which I'm really disappointed about, because there's so many interesting questions going on and such a fascinating discussion. So I just wanted to thank Fiona, Helen, June and Miranda for contributing this evening. It's been really, really interesting, and we could go on for a long time. Do join us on Empathy Day, June the 10th, and do come to the Empathy Conversation. And just to say that after this, we'll just send you out all of you the early years toolkit, so that you can see some of the things that we've been talking about. But just to say again, a huge thank you to all four of our speakers for such an interesting evening. And if the speakers could just stay on the call afterwards, that would be brilliant. But thanks to everyone, and have a wonderful rest of the evening.